This is Lecture 3, Part 2 about marriage, kinship, and family. At this point, you've watched the first part of this lecture about gender and sexuality. And these are, of course, as I mentioned, related. So if in the last part of the lecture, in Part 1, we were really focusing on individuals and individual identities, in this part of the lecture, we're going to build on that to talk about relationships and institutions, particularly relationships like marriage and family and broader kin networks. All of which, again, are connected both through those questions of identity and to the larger questions of society, like economics, politics, etc. So let's go ahead and do that now. Okay, so let's start with a bit of an overview on some of the big themes that I want you to think about for this set of topics. So marriage is something that, at least in the US, we have a tendency to think about in terms of things like romantic emotions, right? And that is certainly a part of what marriage is. But I think from an anthropological level, and when we want to think more broadly and cross-culturally about marriage, what it really is a social institution that confers both rights and responsibilities. And those rights and responsibilities connect to various aspects of daily life, right? So it's not just about love and affection and all of those things. It's also about things like labor, right? Like who is going to do what kinds of work and toward whose benefit. Things like wealth and possessions. Power, right? Both in terms of gender dynamics and more broadly in terms of sort of family dynamics and lineages, which we'll talk about in a second. And concepts of relatedness, right? So marriage is both about the relationship between the marriage partners, but it also confers a sense of relatedness on a lot of other people. For example, the family members related to those marriage partners, and certainly any children that derive from that marriage. So we'll talk through some of those issues in this lecture. Kinship is a broader term that anthropologists and others use to think about the various forms that human relatedness take. Right? So it's certainly about something that we would call family, but it's somewhat broader than that, right? And in fact, the idea of being related to other people as kin can take a few different routes, as your book, for example, mentions. So one is the idea that you're related to some people by blood. That's usually the metaphor that people use, right? A blood relation. And those are the people who you have a sort of a connection to through biological reproduction, if you will, right? You're also related to people through marriage, right? So you don't understand yourself to have the same quote-unquote blood, but you certainly consider them to be part of your kin network. And then finally, there's also kin by choice, right? So although we may think of blood relations and marriage relations as the sort of more traditional or more broadly recognized sources of kinship, there are also plenty of families that are families of choice, right? Where you decide to create kin relations with others based on all kinds of different affinities that you may recognize among yourselves. Now, within marriage and within kinship networks, within families, there's various roles and statuses that people take relative to one another. And those roles and statuses vary a lot cross-culturally, as you've been reading about in the stuff you read for this week. So one way to think about how those roles and statuses sort of function within families is, and you can reflect on this in your own lives, is sort of who's the most important relative, by which I mean who is the person related to you who sort of has the biggest impact on you, or who is the person that everybody goes to, or is the person who makes a lot of the decisions, or however else you want to think about it. So depending on the context, that person could be the mother, the father. In some cases, an uncle can be extremely important, right? So that's one part of it. The other part of thinking about roles and statuses within families is to think about how related you are to the other people in your family network, which I know may sound a little bit odd right now, but we'll talk about this further when we talk about descent. There are plenty of kin systems where people understand themselves to be basically more related to some parts of their kin network than others, right? So, for example, are you more related or more closely related or more importantly related, for example, to your father's side of the family versus your mother's side of the family, right? Or are you more or less related to people who are one generation from you or two generations from you or three generations from you, or are you equally related to all of them, right? These are some of the variations we see when we look cross-culturally at families and kinship. Okay, now we're going to dig into marriage a little bit more. Marriage, if you remember way back to our first lecture, is something that we can consider pretty much or almost a sort of human universal, in the sense that we find some form of marriage in the vast majority of places. Although, of course, you are going to look at an exception to that in this week's materials. So we know that that kind of an institution that is what is considered to be an enduring bond among people that forms the basis for both social and biological reproduction, right? That's basically what marriage is, and that confers rights and responsibilities on the people who enter into that union. That exists in most places, but it takes an enormous number of forms. It's incredibly variable, and it varies in a number of different ways, okay? So the first sort of more obvious one is that the number of partners or the number of people one can be married to at the same time varies, right? The standard, and certainly the legal expectation in a country like the United States, is monogamy, which means you're married to one person. Now, to be more accurate, I think it's more what people actually do to call the U.S. form of marriage something like serial monogamy, right? So people are only married to one person at a time, but it is quite common for people to have multiple partners over the course of a lifetime, right? So monogamy, we would see basically two partners, right? Each person is only married to one other person. There are plenty of places in the world, it's very common worldwide for people to be married to more than one person at the same time, right? And there's two variations on this. As you can see, I put in these little corny graphics just to help you visualize it, but clearly, you know, it's a little silly and very ethnocentric, since the wedding garb that is shown in this top image is very specific to certain places in the world. Most people don't dress like that when they get married, but okay, it's what we've got. So polygamy is the broader category of marriages that involve more than two people. Polygyny being a circumstance in which one man is married to more than one woman, and polyandry being a circumstance in which one woman is married to more than one man. The latter, polyandry, is fairly rare, but there are places in the world where that is practiced. For example, there are parts of Tibet and Nepal where it is a common marriage form for one woman to marry a set of brothers, right, to have multiple husbands. Polygyny, one man having more than one wife, is quite common in many places in the world. We also see, of course, variations in the gender of the partners. So the image on the bottom, certainly, as we know in the U.S., not only is it a form of marriage practiced for a long time, it is now a legal form of marriage for same-sex partners to wed. And as your book pointed out, same-sex partnerships, enduring partnerships, have taken place in many places in the world for a very long time, whether socially or formally recognized or not. So it certainly is one of the variations of marriage that we want to think about. And then a final sort of component or characteristic of marriage I want to point out is how related the marriage partners are or can be to people you are related to by blood, right? So we already talked in the previous slide about different sorts of relatedness. Consanguinal relationships are relationships by blood. Affinal relationships are relationships by marriage. And different places in the world have different attitudes about how closely related those two forms can be. So these are some anthro terms that were used in your book. So in a context where endogamy is practiced, that means that you are expected to find marriage partners from within your kin network. Not very close within your kin network, right? So we're not talking about marrying a brother or sister, but there are contexts where, in fact, it is preferred to marry one of your cousins. Exogamy, on the other hand, is the privileging of marrying outside, right? So in that context, it's expected, preferred, or required that you are going to find marriage partners from outside your kin group. And again, different societies sort of set up different boundaries for what counts as inside and what counts as outside, right? Like how distant from you does someone need to be considered a viable marriage partner? There are, again, culturally variable expectations around all that stuff. Okay. Some other points of variation in terms of marriage and family, right? And particularly how marriage then leads into concepts and practices around family and kin networks. One is residence. It's quite important in many places in the world where, for example, a newly married couple will reside, where they will locate themselves vis-a-vis the rest of their family. And there's a few different sort of variations on this that anthropologists have noted as important. So a neo-local, and think about like the origins of the word, right? Neo, new, local, location, right? This will make it easy to remember. So in a neo-local pattern, then the newly married couple would be expected to basically sort of set off on their own and find their own place to live. Not to live, for example, with either one or the other sets of parents, right? Or not to locate themselves close to the family of either partner. It's neo-local. So, go off and find your own house somewhere else, right? Whereas a patrilocal or matrilocal system, and again, I will say this is a gendered system that also assumes a heterosexual couple, right? So there is that sort of lack of recognition of same-sex marriage built into this terminology, right? So anthropology, like every other scholarly discipline, has a history that is not always up to date. So we need to sort of bear that in mind, right? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense, for example, for a same-sex couple to think in these terms, right? But so the patrilocal residence pattern, again, assuming here, which is, making an ass out of you and me, but we're still going to assume a heterosexual couple would mean that a patrilocal system is one in which it is expected that the newly married couple will live near the groom's family, right? Near or with the groom's family. Matrilocal, the couple would live near or with the bride's or the woman's family, okay? So again, you may think, well, who cares where they live? Part of the issue here is what we're starting to see is, again, marriage and kinship are not just about the romantic partnership between these two people. It's also about how it feeds into broader systems, broader social systems. And those social systems are not just concerned with family affection and love and romance and all of that. They're also concerned with things like work, right? So depending on which kind of residence system, it's also basically where that new partner is going to invest their resource as a human being, meaning their ability to add wealth to the family, their ability to participate in work, to contribute labor, to contribute children, all of those things, right? So that's why residence becomes important. It's also about how the new addition to a family in the form of a new marriage partner is understood to contribute to the growth of an existing family line, okay? In many places in the world, marriage is not just a social exchange, it's also a financial exchange, by which I mean that there is some passage of goods or wealth between families, the families of the new partners. This is not uncommon even, if you've ever gone to any kind of marriage in the United States, there's lots of gift giving involved, right? This is a fairly common thing across the world, that marriage also includes some kind of exchange of material possessions. In some places, it takes different forms than others, though, right? So in some places, there's an expectation that everybody gives gifts to the couple. In other places, there's a gift that passes from one family to the other. So bride wealth and dowry are two common forms of that. Bride wealth being where the groom's family would provide a gift or some kind of wealth or money or possessions to the bride's family, and dowry where the bride's family would provide that kind of exchange of wealth toward the groom's family, right? So again, the idea that the moving around of these families, right? When one marriage partner is going to basically leave their natal family and get added to their family by marriage, there's often a sort of sense of exchange, right? Like a person is going from one social group to another and something else is coming back, something else like wealth. So again, this is just to underline that marriage, family, all this stuff, it's about a bunch of different things attached to daily life. Now, one of the most interesting elements of thinking about marriage, kinship, and family is thinking about ideas about descent. That is the creation of basically family lineages, right? If you've ever, for example, done a family tree about your own family, right, which is a pretty common thing you do even in elementary school, and it's gotten a lot more popular in recent years with these sites like Ancestry.com and all those sort of online genealogy sites. If you've ever done those, you know that that's exactly what this is about, right? It's not only knowing who is in your family tree, but using the family tree as sort of the basis for understanding things like what your identity is, right? Which family or which part of the family do you quote unquote belong to? And this is also the basis for things like inheritance, right? So how does wealth pass from one generation to the next? What is the direction that wealth flows, right? It's common for older generations to bequeath some of their possessions and wealth and whatever to the younger generations. But that doesn't follow the same path everywhere. And the path it follows is often based on a concept of descent, okay? So I want to talk about a few variations on descent, forms of descent. Bilateral, patrilineal, and matrilineal, okay? Patrilineal and matrilineal forms of descent are what we call a unilineal sort of descent. So uni meaning one, right? So in a patrilineal or matrilineal system, descent flows down basically one side of the family, either the father's side or the mother's side. A bilateral system is one where there is equal relatedness on both sides, right? By, two. So, for example, right, if we look at, and these little charts, I hope they didn't confuse you too much when you saw them in your reading. Anthropologists love these little charts, okay? This is how, since the very beginning of the field of anthropology, more than 100 years ago, anthropologists have been really fascinated with families and relatedness and kin and all this stuff. And so to keep track of that, anthropologists developed this sort of system for notating it. And it's really just a way to chart how people are related in a way that allows you to see it, right? Like if you wrote a big story about it, it would be much harder to sort of visualize what families look like. So this is just, that system. So before I get into bilateral descent, let me just make sure that people understand. So again, you probably had to make one of these in grade school, so you may already know what I'm talking about. So a couple things you need to understand, just to understand this chart. One is female is represented by the circle, male is represented by a triangle, right? So every time you see a circle, that's a woman. Every time you see a triangle, that's a man, okay? The little equal sign, that's marriage, okay? So anytime you see that, you see people getting married, right? the up and down lines, like the levels, indicate generations, right? So these folks down here are the children, right, or the offspring of this generation. And this is the previous generation, right? So it goes down in time. So the closest to the present is down here. Ego is the person from whose perspective the chart is being created. So for example, if you had to do one of those, family trees of yourself, either in grade school or wherever, you are ego, the person creating the chart. You are sort of the beginning for this. And what you're trying to chart is how are various people related to this individual ego, okay? So that's the sort of basics of how this works. So back to bilateral descent, right? Bi, to, means that in this kind of a kinship system, ego is equally related to both sides of the family, right? You see that everything is sort of blacked in. That is demonstrating that this is sort of an equally related set of individuals. So ego is not any more related to his or her mother or father, or this grandmother or this grandmother, right? That there's equal relatedness. So it's bilateral. Descent flows down both sides. Now, as I said, there are also unilineal descent systems. That's where, again, there's only one side. And there's two versions of that, patrilineal and matrilineal, right? And again, remember, like, these terms, think about the sort of origins of those pieces of the word, right? Patri, father, matri, mother, right? So patrilineal descent is one where descent, meaning your identity, your belonging in a family, your potential for inheritance, right, flows down the male line. So from the father to his children, okay? Now, and again, that is what this chart is showing. So here's father, right? Say father and mother, this is a married couple. Father, his descendants, so to speak, are his children, right? But then notice what happens in the third generation here. It goes again through the male line, all right? And the reason for that is because this is a system where men, the males, stay within the patrilineage, and the females, for example, the daughters and the sisters, marry out into somebody else's patrilineage. So what you effectively have is a passage of descent from father to son to father to son to father to son, okay? That's not the only unilineal descent system. We also have matrilineal descent, where descent is passed from a mother to her children, right? And parallel to what I just described for the patrilineal system, the most important relationships are from mother to daughter, mother to daughter to mother to daughter to mother to daughter, right? Now, an important point that your book makes is that is not the same. A matrilineal system is not the same as saying matriarchal. So in other words, it doesn't mean that women have all the power. It does mean that women control certain resources way more than men, right? And there is a certain power in that. But there are men in a matrilineal system who are really important. It's just the question is which men. So back to our system here. So here's the mother, right? Remember, this is a couple, and circle is the woman, right? So from a mother to her children. But as you see, just like the sort of flip side of the patrilineal system I just showed you, the girls, the daughters, are the ones who remain in the matrilineage. The sons are going to marry out, right, for the most part. So the most important relationship is mother to daughter. The men who are important are not, for example, the father, right? For a child, the most important man is the uncle, the mother's brother, all right? Because he is also connected to that same matrilineage. So again, this is back to those original questions that I asked you in terms of thinking about dissent, right? In different cultural contexts, different relatives in a network play different roles, right? So in some places, one's father is the most important or most influential man. In other places, particularly in places that follow matrilineal descent, your uncle might be the most important man in your family. Okay, final thing, I just wanted to leave you with sort of a thought exercise, because we've already reflected on the fact that marriage is about a lot more than just romantic love, and one of the things it's about is work. And I also think one of the things that happens when I talk with students about marriage and family is the ways that people marry and live in families elsewhere in the world can seem really different. And it's important to also just reflect on all these issues in your home family, right? In the family you grew up in or the family you have married into. And one of the places we can really think about that, I think, in U.S. society is in terms of the relationship between marriage and work, particularly household work. Most people in the U.S. work outside of the home, right? Many do. So there's this sort of combination of kinds of tasks that many Americans need to deal with. That's whatever you do at your job and maintaining the household. And one thing that has continued to be a part of expectations in American households is the sort of gender division of labor. Who does the housework, right? If everybody's going to go out and work at their job for most of the day, right? Who is expected to find the time to squeeze in the work of doing the laundry, doing the dishes, mopping the floor, all those different things, right? Cleaning, house care, shopping, all that stuff. And I think thinking about how that kind of work gets meted out to different members of the household and how or whether who does that work has changed over time is a really interesting way to think about American families, right? And about American kinship systems. So certainly we know there was an expectation in the past, for example, we can go back to the mid-20th century where it was absolutely expected that the female members of the household would do most, if not all, of that kind of housework, that domestic labor. That has shifted some over time, although if you look at even polling data from right now, you'll find that lots of people say that women still bear the brunt of that work, do the majority of that work, even if they are working full-time. So reflect on this in your own household, right? And you can reflect on the household you grew up in. If you have since married or live in a different household, reflect on what's the same or what's different? Has it changed over time? And what, if anything, does this tell us about that relationship between gender, family, and work?